going back to the dashboard here, we've set up our shifts. Now we're going to have a look at what queXS calls a sample. Now a sample is a list. It's a list of telephone numbers or names and telephone numbers to call. queXS doesn't do any, I guess you'd call it, list creation. You have to create it in a separate system, and it expects to receive the sample file in a CSV file. So let's import one. Now what I'll do is I'll show you what a default sample file looks like. So here is the queXS software. I've just extracted the zip of the queXS installation, and if you go to the user doc folder, you'll find there are some test sample files here. So here we have test sample. I'll just open that up so you can see what it looks like. Okay, so basically it's just a comma-separated file that has the first row being the column names and the remainder being the data. So we've got a name here, we've got a phone number, we've got a postcode in this case, and a second telephone number. So your respondent might have multiple numbers assigned to them. They might not, but if they do, you can assign multiple additional numbers to your respondents. The only required thing for queXS is to have at least a phone number associated with the record. So in that case, for example, if you are calling people phone numbers at random, you would generate a CSV file that just had one column with telephone numbers, and you just put a header, call it number, for example. And then queXS would be able to operate calling those people at random. But if you have more details about your respondents in advance, for example, you're calling people from a list that you already have, you'd put as much detail as you want the interviewer to have access to there. So let's test loading this test sample in. So again, I'll go to the user doc directory and load the CSV file. And I'll just call this sample again test sample, because it's just for testing. You'll note here it's given us the option to import as much or as little of the sample file as we like. So these are the column names that we had in the CSV file. And we have to choose what type, what this column is in for the purposes of queXS. Now, you have a few different options here, and these will relate to the way queXS operates on the data that you import. So the first column here was the respondent's name. So if we tell queXS that this is the respondent's first name, then it's going to display that name for us in a prominent place for when we're trying to contact them. The thing that is required is a primary phone number. That means the number you're going to dial first. So we will assign that to this number column. Now a postcode, there's a special table in queXS that allows you to map a postal code to a time zone. That's populated with data for Australia and the United States. If you have that data for your own region, you can add it to the queXS database. And then if you have postcode data about your respondent, then it will assign the correct time zone to them when you load them in and you identify the column as postcode. I'll leave that off for now. A string variable loaded into queXS just becomes available for templating purposes, similar to what Lime Survey does with its curly brace templating system. The other thing that queXS will do is it also has a correspondence table between telephone area codes and time zones. So it will try to assign it. Again, that's loaded in for United States and Australian time zones. For European, time zones based on telephone area codes. You could again load them in directly to the database if you have that detail for where you're operating. If you have a secondary or tertiary or even more telephone numbers available for a case, you just assign them a phone number variable type, and that it will be a new number available to call for the respondent, but you must only have one and only one primary phone number. The ability to show it to the operator is if you have some sample data that you want to list prominently to the telephone interviewer while they're calling. So you might want to show the details of their postcode, for example. So I'll just give an example of having that there. So let's add that. Okay, so now we've added a sample. We can assign that to the questionnaire we're working on. Now, the way queXS works is you can have one sample file that's assigned to multiple projects. So this test sample, for example, we only have to upload once, but we could use it for every single test questionnaire we create in queXS. So let's get started and have a look at our questionnaire we have, which is called Test for Interviewers. And it's just noting here we currently don't have a sample assigned to the questionnaire, but we do want to add this one. So there's only one available. If we had more than one, we'd choose from this list. And when you assign a sample, you have these options available to you for how you want the sample to work with the queXS scheduler, call scheduler, and how you also want it to work with Lime Survey. Okay, so these options here about the number of calls to be made will change the way the scheduler will operate. If you have 0 here under max calls, you'll note this 0 equals unlimited. Then a sample record, so for example, this record here, at this phone number could be called an unlimited amount of times. As soon as the number is available to call next, no matter how many times it's called, it will be scheduled up for the interviewers. Now, it doesn't mean that this is going to be called straight away, because depending on the outcome of your call, queXS knows to wait a while before you try and call it again. For example, the default is after nobody answers, it'll wait at least 3 hours before you try and call the number again. But if max calls is unlimited here, then theoretically every 3 hours this number could be called indefinitely. Typically you wouldn't want to do this as a waste of resources, so you might set the maximum number of calls to 6, for example. Now, a call attempt differs from a call in that only when you have multiple numbers assigned to a sample record. So for example, I've got 2 phone numbers assigned to these in this sample. Maximum calls being 6 would mean this record would become available, for example, up to 3 times, because if we called both these numbers and they both didn't answer, it counts as 2 calls. A call attempt, though, doesn't matter how many phone numbers you have assigned to a record. A call attempt is one. No matter how many calls you make at one time, you can then limit that. So if this was 6, for example, and this was unlimited, then, for example, this person could be called up to 12 times because we could try both their numbers 6 times. So that's the difference between a call and a call attempt. Okay, so let's just set that at, let's say we don't want to call someone more than 6 times. We can choose whether we want to script an answering machine message. So what this means is, for this list here, if at any time an answering machine comes up, if this is set to never, then when the interviewer hears the answering machine message and clicks the button that they've heard an answering machine message, if this is set to never, then the system is just going to hang up, or at least instruct you to hang up your call. If we set this to 1, for example, then instead we'll get a script saying what message we want to leave on the answering machine, but it'll only do this once. So if there's a note that we've already left an answering machine message, it's not going to come up to leave another answering machine message. It's going to instruct the interviewer to hang up. Okay, we've also got how we want the list to be called, in what order. If it's set to no, which is the default, then queXS is going to try and go through this list in this order as it appears in the file here. If you choose select randomly, then it's going to pick from this list randomly the numbers to call. Allowing new numbers to be drawn, this by default is on yes, especially when you create a new sample. But let's say, for example, you've started calling these people and you don't want to, and you've called the first 20 and you want to stop calling any more people on the list. You can set this to no at any time, and it will keep calling the first 20 people, but it won't try and call any new people. It'll just keep trying to call these people that have already been drawn from the sample. Okay, now there's this other function here which has quite a big impact on the way the system works. Generating cases for all sample records. Now the default for this is no, and what that means is when we assign this sample to this questionnaire, and then we look at Lime Survey's participant table, nothing will have changed. So queXS knows we should start calling these people, and it will once interviewers start working, but only at the time when there is someone to call will a record be drawn from this list, and only then will a record appear in the participant table of Lime Survey as well. Now, what some studies do, typically known as web first methodology, would be to email, for example, everybody on the list first if you had an email address available for them, and then maybe call them a week later if they haven't responded. And in that case, you want everyone on this list to appear in Lime Survey and in queXS at the same time. And in that case, what you'd do is you would choose this generate cases for all sample records variable. And you would then, you can also say it to only do it when there's a valid email address attached to the sample record. What would happen then is that queXS would create a new record, call record, for everybody on this list. It would also create a token or a participant record for everyone on the list, and then allow you to go into Lime Survey and do your invitation, your email invitation. What queXS could then do is then it will wait a week, or it will depend on which outcome you choose here, but this default outcome of an email invitation that has been sent means that queXS will wait a week, and then those numbers will be made available to call only if they haven't completed it themselves in Lime Survey. We'll turn that off for now. We don't have email addresses in our record, but that's how you'd implement a web-first methodology using queXS and Lime Survey. Okay, the other thing you can do is choose which records you want to have copied over from queXS into the participant table. So the default is that the name will be copied over into the first name record of the Lime Survey token or participant table. And you can choose what other details you want to put across. Like, of course, if you had an email, you'd want to push that across into the Lime Survey email field. Otherwise, if you had also attributes enabled in Lime Survey's attribute section here, if you had participant attributes added, then queXS could be instructed to copy details from the sample over to the Lime Survey attribute, not just to these default ones. But for now, we'll just move across the name variable into Lime Survey. Okay, so let's assign this sample. Great. Okay, so now we can see the sample has been assigned to the questionnaire, and it's just a summary of what options we have, which can be changed by clicking edit here. You can also unassign a sample at any time. Unassigning a sample won't delete records. In other words, if you'd already called the first 3 people here of your sample and you unassign it, then those people won't be able to be called anymore. Neither will anyone else on the list. But if you reassign the sample, they're not going to be called again because the link still exists between these 3 records. I mean, they're not going to be called again as if they're fresh. It's still going to have all the data about the calls you've made to these sample records. So you can safely unassign and reassign a sample to a questionnaire if you don't want those numbers to be called anymore. But if you reassign it, it will still remember that you've already attempted them, for example, if you had. You can also assign multiple samples to a questionnaire. So if you had a list of numbers and you need to add some more, you just assign a new sample.